He promised to marry the first person who touched the forgotten trash outside his luxury restaurant. But he never imagined that the person who stepped forward would be the one woman who wanted nothing from him. Alexander Romano had spent years surrounded by people who wanted something: money, influence, connections. Everyone who entered his world seemed to carry a hidden request behind their smile. At 39 years old, the powerful Mafia boss had become a man who could read intentions before people even spoke. In the world of New York's elite, trust was rare, and genuine kindness was almost impossible to find. His name carried weight across business circles, but behind the tailored suits, private meetings, and carefully controlled reputation was a man who had slowly stopped believing that people could act without expecting a reward. Alexander owned one of the most exclusive restaurants in Manhattan, a place where celebrities, executives, and influential figures gathered beneath golden lights and expensive decorations. Yet despite all the luxury surrounding him, he often felt surrounded by emptiness. One evening, after another disappointing meeting where people competed to impress him, Alexander stood near the entrance of his restaurant and watched the city move outside the glass doors. People rushed through the streets carrying coffee cups, briefcases, and personal struggles that nobody else noticed. Among the noise and movement, he saw something that caught his attention. A small pile of trash had been left near the sidewalk beside his restaurant's entrance. Guests walked around it without looking. Employees passed by assuming someone else would handle it. Important people continued their conversations while ignoring the small mess beneath their feet. Alexander watched silently. To him, it represented something larger than a piece of litter. It represented how easily people ignored things that were inconvenient or beneath their attention. The next morning, during a private conversation with his closest advisors, Alexander made a statement that surprised everyone in the room. "I wonder how many people would help if nobody was watching." His advisors exchanged uncertain looks. Alexander continued, "Everyone wants to be close to power. Everyone wants a place at the table. But what if the person worthy of trust was the one who never asked for anything?" The conversation eventually became a challenge. Not a public announcement. Not a publicity stunt. A personal test created by a man who had forgotten what sincerity looked like. Alexander made a promise that seemed impossible. Whoever was willing to pick up that forgotten trash without knowing there was a reward waiting would receive the greatest gift he could offer. His advisors laughed at first. They assumed someone would quickly discover the opportunity and pretend to be kind. Alexander expected the same. He believed people only acted generously when there was something to gain. He did not know that someone would soon prove him wrong. Across the city, Amara Johnson began another ordinary morning without knowing that her life was about to change. At 32 years old, Amara was a curvy black woman who worked at a local community center, helping families find resources, organizing neighborhood programs, and supporting people who often felt forgotten. She lived simply, valued honesty, and measured success by the number of people she could help rather than the amount of money she earned. Amara never considered herself extraordinary. She believed kindness was not something people deserved applause for. It was simply something people owed one another. That morning, while walking through Manhattan on her way to deliver supplies for a community event, she noticed something others had ignored. Near the entrance of the elegant restaurant stood a pile of trash left behind after the previous night's crowd. People passed by without stopping. Some looked away. Others stepped around it. Amara paused. She did not know who owned the restaurant. She did not know who was watching. She did not know that a powerful man had created an impossible promise just one day earlier. She only saw something that needed to be done. Without hesitation, she picked up the discarded items and placed them into the nearby trash container. A security camera above the entrance quietly captured the moment. Inside the restaurant, Alexander received an alert from the monitor system and looked at the screen expecting to see someone searching for a reward. Instead, he saw a woman who walked away without even looking toward the building. For the first time in years, Alexander Romano found himself unable to understand someone's intentions. And that simple moment would begin a story that would change everything he believed about trust, power, and the kind of person truly worthy of his heart. The security footage played again on the large screen inside Alexander Romano's private office, but this time he watched it differently. The first time, he had expected to see someone searching for attention or a hidden opportunity. Instead, he saw a woman who had no idea anyone was watching. She had noticed something others ignored, fixed it without hesitation, and walked away without looking toward the restaurant doors. For a man who had spent years studying people's motives, that simple act was impossible to explain. Alexander leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable as the city lights reflected across the glass windows behind him. "Find out who she is," he said calmly. His assistant, Marcus, looked surprised. "You want a background check on someone who picked up trash?" Alexander glanced back at the paused image of Amara Johnson. Not because of what she did, because of what she did not do. Marcus understood immediately. The woman had not looked around for approval. She had not waited for praise. She had not even noticed the restaurant's security camera above the entrance. In Alexander's world, that was rare. The next morning, the information arrived on his desk. Amara Johnson, 32 years old, community center employee, volunteer organizer. No criminal record. No history of seeking publicity. No connection to his businesses. No interest in wealth or influence. At first glance, there was nothing extraordinary about her background. But as Alexander continued reading, the details began to tell a different story. Amara had spent years helping families in her neighborhood find food assistance, educational resources, and emergency support. She organized weekend programs for children whose parents worked long hours. She often stayed late at the community center because someone needed help filling out paperwork or simply needed someone willing to listen. Yet what surprised Alexander most was that almost none of these actions had ever been publicly recognized. There were no interviews, no social media campaigns, no attempts to turn kindness into personal branding. She helped because she believed helping mattered. That afternoon, Alexander visited the restaurant earlier than usual and stood near the same entrance where the security footage had captured Amara. The trash was gone. The sidewalk was clean. The world had already moved on from the small moment that had changed his perspective. But Alexander remained there, thinking about how many people had walked past the same problem without seeing it. His longtime associate, Victor, noticed his unusual silence. "You are thinking about her," Victor said. Alexander looked toward the busy street. "I am thinking about how many people want to be seen as good, but how few people actually choose to do good when there is nothing waiting for them." Victor smiled slightly. "You sound different." Alexander did not answer immediately. He had spent years believing power revealed people's true nature. The wealthy wanted more wealth. The ambitious wanted more influence. The desperate wanted opportunities. But Amara had challenged that belief without even knowing she had done so. Meanwhile, Amara continued living her normal life. She arrived at the community center carrying boxes of donated supplies and immediately began helping organize them with her coworkers. When someone thanked her, she simply smiled and replied, "Everyone deserves a little help sometimes." She had no idea that a powerful man had been studying her actions from a distance. She had no idea that a promise made inside a luxury restaurant was slowly moving toward her. She only knew that small choices mattered. Later that evening, Alexander attended a private dinner with several influential guests. The conversation eventually turned toward his unusual promise. Many laughed when they heard about the person who cleaned up the forgotten trash. "You cannot seriously believe that was some great test of character," one guest said. Alexander remained calm. "Why not?" The guest smiled. "Because anyone can pick up garbage." Alexander looked around the table. "Exactly. Anyone can. But not everyone will." The room became quiet for a moment. That sentence stayed with him long after dinner ended. For the first time in years, Alexander was not interested in someone's wealth, connections, or status. He was interested in understanding the person who had unknowingly challenged everything he thought he knew about human nature. And somewhere across the city, Amara Johnson continued her ordinary life, unaware that her simplest act of kindness had become the first chapter in a promise that would soon change both of their futures. Amara Johnson never imagined that a simple moment on a quiet Manhattan sidewalk would become the reason a powerful man questioned everything he believed about people. Days continued to pass, and she remained focused on the life she had always known. Every morning, she arrived at the community center before most employees, unlocked the doors, turned on the lights, and prepared the space for families who needed support. To Amara, kindness was not a grand gesture reserved for special occasions. It was a daily responsibility, something as natural as breathing. She had grown up watching her grandmother help neighbors without expecting recognition, and that lesson had shaped every decision she made. Meanwhile, Alexander Romano continued studying the woman who had unknowingly challenged his entire perspective. He had expected to find a hidden ambition behind her actions. Perhaps she wanted attention. Perhaps she hoped someone influential would notice her. Perhaps there was a reason she had chosen that specific moment to clean the sidewalk. But every detail told the same story. There was no performance, no strategy, no desire for reward. Alexander found himself returning to the security footage more often than he wanted to admit. The image of Amara quietly picking up the forgotten trash remained in his mind because it represented something he had almost forgotten existed. Genuine kindness without expectation. One evening, Alexander asked Marcus to arrange a meeting with Amara. Not an official meeting, not a business conversation. He simply wanted to understand the person behind the action that had changed his thinking. The following afternoon, Alexander visited the community center without announcing his identity. He arrived wearing a simple dark jacket instead of the expensive suits people associated with him. For once, he wanted to be treated like an ordinary person. Inside the community center, he immediately noticed something different. The atmosphere was not built around status or influence. It was built around connection. Volunteers carried boxes of supplies. Parents spoke with staff members. Children worked on educational activities at nearby tables. Everyone seemed to know Amara, and everyone seemed grateful she was there. Alexander watched as she helped an elderly man organize paperwork, answered questions from a young mother, and encouraged a teenager who was preparing for a job interview. She never rushed anyone. She never acted as though her time was more valuable than theirs. Eventually, Amara noticed Alexander standing near the entrance. She approached with a welcoming smile. "Hello, can I help you find someone?" Alexander introduced himself simply. "My name is Alexander." He did not mention the restaurant. He did not mention the promise. He did not mention the security footage. Amara smiled politely. "Nice to meet you, Alexander. Are you here for assistance, or are you looking to volunteer?" The question caught him off guard. Most people who recognized his name immediately changed their behavior. They became nervous, impressed, or overly careful. Amara did none of those things. She simply treated him like anyone else who walked through the door. "I am here because I wanted to understand something," Alexander replied. Amara tilted her head slightly. "Understand what?" He looked around the room before answering. "Why you help people when nobody is watching?" For a brief moment, Amara seemed confused. Then she smiled. "Because people still need help whether someone is watching or not." That answer stayed with Alexander. It was simple, yet it carried the kind of truth he rarely encountered. He had spent years surrounded by people who calculated every decision based on what they could gain. Amara made decisions based on what she could give. As they continued talking, Alexander learned about her dreams. She wanted to expand the community center's programs. She wanted children to have better opportunities. She wanted elderly neighbors to feel less alone. None of her goals involved personal wealth or recognition. Every dream involved helping someone else. Before leaving, Alexander looked back at the busy room one final time. He had entered expecting to find an interesting person. Instead, he discovered someone who represented everything his world lacked. Amara had no idea who he truly was, and that was exactly why Alexander respected her even more. She had not treated him differently because she wanted something from him. She had treated him differently because she believed every person deserved respect. As Alexander walked back toward his waiting car, he realized the impossible promise he had made was no longer about finding someone worthy of a reward. It was about discovering whether he was worthy of someone like Amara Johnson. Alexander Romano had spent his entire life understanding power, but he had never expected a woman who owned almost nothing to reveal how little he understood about true influence. After leaving the community center, he sat silently in the back of his car while the city moved around him. The streets of Manhattan were filled with people rushing toward their next destination, yet his thoughts remained in the small building where Amara Johnson had treated him like any other person who walked through the door. She did not ask about his wealth. She did not recognize his reputation. She did not attempt to impress him. She simply offered kindness because that was who she was. For a man who had built his entire world around careful observation, that honesty was impossible to ignore. Over the next several days, Alexander continued learning about Amara, but not from a distance filled with suspicion. This time, he wanted to understand her because he respected her. He discovered that the trash she picked up had not been the first time she had done something unnoticed. Years earlier, when her neighborhood community center struggled with limited resources, Amara had quietly organized volunteers to repaint old classrooms, repair donated furniture, and create welcoming spaces for children. She had never placed her name on any project. She had never requested recognition. She believed the purpose of helping disappeared the moment people helped only to be praised. Marcus noticed the change in Alexander almost immediately. The man who once dismissed emotional decisions now spent evenings reading community reports and asking questions about programs that had nothing to do with profit. "You are different lately," Marcus said during a private meeting. Alexander looked up from the documents in front of him. "Am I?" Marcus nodded. "Before, you studied people to protect yourself. Now you study them because you want to understand them." Alexander remained quiet because he knew the statement was true. For years, he had believed distance kept him safe. He thought trust was a weakness and kindness was something people used against others. Amara had challenged those beliefs without ever trying to change him. She had simply lived according to principles he had forgotten. Meanwhile, Amara continued her life without realizing how much attention her actions had attracted. She was preparing a community event when Alexander unexpectedly returned to the center. This time, he arrived openly and introduced himself properly. The volunteers immediately recognized his name, and the atmosphere changed slightly. Amara noticed the difference and looked at him with curiosity. "You are not just Alexander, are you?" she asked. He gave a small smile. "No, I suppose I am not." He explained that he owned several businesses and that he had recently learned about her work through a personal experience. Amara listened carefully but remained calm. "I hope you did not come here because you think you need to fix something." Alexander looked surprised. "What do you mean?" Amara placed a stack of donated books onto a nearby table. "Sometimes people with money see communities like this and immediately think they need to save everyone. But most people do not need someone to save them. They need someone willing to stand beside them." Her words stayed with him. In his world, power often meant being the person who provided answers. Amara reminded him that sometimes the greatest form of leadership was simply showing up and listening. Before leaving, Alexander noticed a photograph displayed on the community center wall. It showed Amara standing with a group of children during a neighborhood celebration. The picture was simple, but the smiles were genuine. He asked her about it. She smiled warmly. "That was the day we finished renovating the reading room. Everyone helped. I just happened to organize it." Alexander looked at the photograph again and realized something important. Amara did not see herself as a hero. She saw herself as part of a community. That was exactly what made her extraordinary. Later that evening, Alexander returned to his office and looked at the original promise he had made. The words seemed different now. What began as a test to find someone deserving had become a lesson about himself. He had thought he was searching for someone rare. Instead, he had discovered someone who showed him what he had been missing. For the first time in years, Alexander Romano was not thinking about control, reputation, or power. He was thinking about a woman who picked up a piece of trash because she believed small acts of kindness mattered. And he was beginning to understand that the greatest treasures in life were often the ones people walked past without noticing. For the first time in many years, Alexander Romano found himself facing a question he could not answer with money, influence, or careful strategy. He had spent his life making decisions quickly, reading situations before others noticed them, and maintaining control over every part of his world. Yet one woman who cleaned a sidewalk without expecting anything in return had created uncertainty inside him. Amara Johnson had become the one person he could not simply analyze and categorize. She was not impressed by his reputation. She was not interested in his wealth. She did not treat him differently after learning who he was. Instead, she continued living by the same values she had always followed. That was exactly why Alexander wanted to know her more. But he also knew something important. If he approached her as a powerful man, she would see the position before she saw the person. So he decided to do something unfamiliar. He decided to be honest. A few days later, Alexander returned to the community center during a neighborhood event Amara had organized. The room was filled with families, volunteers, and children participating in activities designed to support learning and creativity. Alexander stood near the entrance for a moment, watching Amara move through the crowd. She carried boxes of supplies, answered questions, and encouraged volunteers with the same patience he had witnessed before. She never appeared to be seeking attention. She simply focused on making sure everyone else felt included. When Amara noticed him, she smiled politely. "Alexander, I did not expect to see you here." He nodded. "I wanted to speak with you." They stepped outside to a quiet area near the community garden behind the building. The afternoon sunlight covered the small space with warmth, creating a peaceful contrast to the busy city streets nearby. Alexander took a moment before speaking. "I owe you an explanation." Amara looked curious but remained calm. "About what?" He told her about the restaurant, the security camera, and the promise he had made. He explained that he had created a challenge because he wanted to know whether anyone would choose kindness without knowing there was a reward waiting. Amara listened carefully. When he finished, she looked at him with a mixture of surprise and concern. "So I was part of a test?" Alexander lowered his eyes slightly. "At first, yes." A quiet silence followed. He expected disappointment. He expected questions. Instead, Amara asked something he never anticipated. "Did you learn what you were hoping to learn?" Alexander looked at her. "I learned that I was asking the wrong question." She waited for him to continue. "I was trying to discover whether someone deserved trust. I should have been asking why I had stopped trusting people in the first place." Amara studied his expression and noticed something unusual. The powerful man standing before her was not trying to impress her. He was admitting that he had been wrong. "That is a difficult thing to admit," she said. Alexander gave a small nod. "It is." Their conversation continued as they walked through the community garden. Amara explained that kindness was not about being perfect. It was about remembering that everyone carried something others could not see. Alexander listened carefully because those words reflected the very thing he had forgotten. He had spent years protecting himself from disappointment by assuming the worst in people. Amara had built her life by believing the best could still exist. Before leaving, Alexander finally addressed the promise that had started everything. "I made a commitment that whoever showed genuine kindness would receive the greatest gift I could offer." Amara looked at him carefully. "And what exactly is that?" Alexander paused. For years, he would have answered with money, property, or influence. But now the answer felt different. "A place beside me." Amara remained silent for a moment. Then she gently shook her head. "Alexander, kindness is not something people do to earn a reward. If you are offering something because you feel obligated, that is not a gift. That is a responsibility." Her response surprised him. Almost everyone in his world accepted opportunities before asking why they were offered. Amara was the first person to question the meaning behind the offer itself. Alexander smiled slightly. "You know, most people would not turn down something from me." Amara smiled back. "Maybe that is why you needed someone who would." As he left the community center that evening, Alexander understood something that changed the way he viewed his promise. He had believed he was searching for someone worthy of standing beside him. But Amara Johnson had already shown him that true worth was never measured by what someone could gain. It was measured by what someone was willing to give when nobody expected anything in return. The days following Alexander Romano's conversation with Amara Johnson felt different from any other period in his life. For years, his schedule had been controlled by meetings, negotiations, and decisions that affected hundreds of people. He had built an empire by understanding power, predicting outcomes, and staying several steps ahead of everyone around him. Yet now, the moments he valued most were the simple conversations that had nothing to do with business. He found himself thinking about Amara's words long after she had walked away. "Kindness is not something people do to earn a reward." That sentence remained in his mind because it challenged the foundation of everything he had believed. Alexander had always measured actions by results. Amara measured them by purpose. The difference was impossible to ignore. Meanwhile, Amara continued her work at the community center without allowing Alexander's attention to change her routine. She still arrived early, still organized programs, and still spent time listening to people who needed support. When volunteers asked about the mysterious businessman who had visited, she simply smiled and said, "He seems like someone trying to understand people better." She did not speak about his wealth or reputation because those things did not define the person she had met. She had seen something else. She had seen someone who was tired of being surrounded by people who wanted something from him. Several weeks later, Alexander invited Amara to visit one of his business properties. He wanted to show her something important, but he did not tell her the reason at first. When she arrived at his office building, she expected another conversation about his promise. Instead, Alexander walked with her through several floors and introduced her to employees from different departments. Amara immediately noticed something unusual. The employees respected Alexander, but many seemed cautious around him. They followed instructions, completed their work, and maintained professionalism. Yet there was a distance between the leader and the people who worked for him. Alexander noticed that she saw it. "You are thinking something," he said. Amara hesitated before answering. "I think. People respect you because of your position. I wonder how many feel comfortable enough to tell you the truth." Her honesty surprised him. Most people carefully chose words around him. Amara simply shared what she observed. "That is something I have been thinking about too," Alexander admitted. He brought her into a private conference room where several employee reports were displayed on a large screen. "I built this company by focusing on efficiency. I thought if people were paid fairly and the business succeeded, that was enough." Amara looked at the reports carefully. Success matters, but people also need to feel valued. Alexander nodded slowly. "You sound like you have been running companies for years." Amara smiled. "No, I have just spent years listening to people." That answer stayed with him. During the meeting, Alexander asked Amara for her opinion on improving workplace culture. At first, she was hesitant. "I do not know your business the way you do," Alexander replied. "But you understand something I do not." "What is that?" she asked. "How people feel when nobody powerful is paying attention." For the first time, Alexander openly admitted a weakness. He knew how to create success, but he did not always know how to create belonging. Amara suggested simple changes. More communication between managers and employees. More opportunities for workers to share ideas. More recognition for people whose efforts were often invisible. None of her suggestions involved expensive programs or complicated strategies. They focused on respect. Over the next month, Alexander began implementing those ideas. Employees noticed the difference gradually. Managers started visiting departments instead of only reviewing numbers. Team meetings became more open. Workers who had once stayed silent began sharing their thoughts. Alexander watched the changes with surprise because they were not created through authority. They were created through understanding. One evening, he met Amara again at the community center. He thanked her for the advice she had given him. She smiled and replied, "You did not need my advice. You needed someone willing to tell you what others were afraid to say." Alexander laughed quietly because he knew she was right. Very few people in his world would challenge him. Even fewer would do so with kindness. As they stood outside the community center beneath the evening lights, Alexander finally understood that the promise he had made was never truly about finding someone to complete a challenge. It was about discovering someone who could reveal the parts of himself he had ignored for years. Amara Johnson had never tried to change Alexander Romano. She had simply shown him a different way to see the world. And for the first time in a very long time, the man who believed he had everything realized there were still lessons he needed to learn. Alexander Romano had spent years building walls around himself, but he never realized those walls were also keeping him away from the very thing he needed most. Over the past several months, Amara Johnson had become the one person who could challenge his perspective without making him feel judged. She did not approach him with demands. She did not try to change his reputation. She simply reminded him that power meant very little if it could not be used to improve the lives of others. Yet as Alexander began embracing this new way of thinking, he discovered that not everyone around him welcomed the change. In his world, many people had built their positions by understanding influence, control, and tradition. They respected Alexander because he was powerful, but they were uncertain when he began making decisions based on compassion instead of convenience. One evening, Alexander gathered his closest advisors at his private office. He announced several new initiatives focused on employee support, community partnerships, and creating better opportunities for people within his businesses. The room remained quiet after he finished. Finally, Victor spoke carefully. "This is different from how you have operated before." Alexander looked toward the city skyline. Maybe that is the point. Some advisors exchanged uncertain expressions. They understood business. They understood profit. But they did not understand why Alexander was allowing the opinions of a community center worker to influence decisions at the highest levels. Alexander did not become defensive. Instead, he simply explained what he had learned. The strongest organizations are not built by people who are afraid to speak. They are built by people who believe their voices matter. Those words reflected ideas Amara had shared with him, but Alexander knew the responsibility belonged to him. He was not changing because someone asked him to. He was changing because he finally understood what kind of leader he wanted to become. Meanwhile, Amara continued noticing the differences in Alexander. She appreciated the improvements he was making, but she also wanted to ensure he understood one important lesson. During a meeting at the community center, she looked at him and said, "Helping people is not about becoming the person everyone depends on. It is about creating a world where people have the opportunity to depend on themselves." Alexander listened carefully. Her words reminded him that true leadership was not about being the only person with answers. It was about creating conditions where others could succeed. Over time, Alexander invited Amara to participate in several community projects connected to his businesses. She agreed only under one condition. "I will help if the people who need support are included in the decisions," she said. Alexander immediately accepted. He had learned that Amara did not want to speak for people. She wanted to make sure people were heard. Their partnership slowly became something neither of them expected. Alexander brought resources, experience, and influence. Amara brought understanding, patience, and a connection to people that money could never create. Together, they built programs that supported employees, helped local families, and created opportunities for young people seeking better futures. Yet despite the changes happening around them, Alexander still had one promise he had not fulfilled. The promise that started everything. The one he had made before he ever knew Amara's name. His advisors occasionally reminded him about it, expecting him to treat it like a commitment that needed to be completed. But Alexander no longer saw it that way. What began as a challenge had transformed into something much deeper. He did not want to offer Amara a place beside him because of a promise. He wanted her beside him because she was the first person who showed him what life looked like beyond power and reputation. One evening, Alexander met Amara outside the community center after a long day of work. The neighborhood was quiet, and the warm glow from the building's windows reflected on the sidewalk where countless people had received help over the years. "I owe you an apology," Alexander said. Amara looked surprised. "For what?" He paused before answering. "For thinking I was the one offering you something valuable." Amara remained silent, allowing him to continue. "I thought my promise was about finding someone worthy of receiving a gift. But I was wrong. The greatest thing that happened was discovering someone who reminded me what truly matters." For the first time, Amara saw a different side of Alexander. Not the businessman, not the Mafia boss, just a man who had learned that humility could be stronger than control. And as they stood together beneath the evening sky, both understood that the promise that started their story was becoming something far more meaningful than either of them had imagined. The promise that had once been created as a simple test had become something neither Alexander Romano nor Amara Johnson could have predicted. What began as a question about whether anyone would show kindness without expecting a reward had transformed into a lesson about trust, humility, and seeing people for who they truly were. Yet even as Alexander continued changing, the world around him was beginning to notice. Employees who had worked for him for years saw a different leader. He still made difficult decisions. He still expected excellence. But now, people also saw patience, understanding, and a willingness to listen. At the center of those changes was Amara, not because she controlled Alexander's choices, but because she reminded him of the values he wanted to represent. Several months later, Alexander invited Amara to attend a major charity event hosted by his organization. The event brought together business leaders, community members, and employees from different parts of the city. For many guests, it was another elegant evening filled with expensive decorations and important conversations. But for Alexander, it represented something much more meaningful. It was the first time he wanted the world to see what he had learned. When Amara arrived, she immediately noticed how different the atmosphere felt compared to the environments Alexander once surrounded himself with. Employees stood beside executives. Community leaders shared conversations with business owners. People who normally existed in separate worlds were now gathered in the same room. Alexander had intentionally created a space where everyone felt included. Before the evening began, he asked Amara to walk with him through the venue. "Do you remember the first time we spoke?" he asked. Amara smiled. "You mean when you told me about your unusual promise?" Alexander laughed softly. "Yes, I thought I was testing the world. I did not realize the world was testing me." Amara looked at him thoughtfully. What matters is what you did after you learned the truth. Those words stayed with him. Alexander knew that changing his actions was more important than admitting his mistakes. Anyone could make a promise. Real character appeared in what someone chose to do afterward. During the event, Alexander stepped onto the stage and looked across the room. He saw employees who had once felt invisible. He saw community members who had received support. He saw people from different backgrounds standing together because they believed cooperation mattered more than status. For a long time, Alexander began. I believed leadership meant having all the answers. I believed strength came from never needing anyone else. But I was wrong. The room became silent. The greatest lesson I learned was that a person's value is not determined by their position, their appearance, or what they can offer someone powerful. It is revealed through the choices they make when nobody is watching. His eyes moved toward Amara. Someone once reminded me that small acts of kindness are not small at all. They can change the way people see the world. The audience listened closely as Alexander explained that the organization's newest community program would be dedicated to supporting local families, creating educational opportunities, and helping people build better futures. He announced that Amara would help guide the initiative, not because of a title, but because of the trust she had earned through years of service. After the announcement, several people approached Amara to congratulate her. She accepted their words with the same humility she had always shown. She did not see herself as someone special. She simply believed everyone deserved compassion. Later that evening, Alexander and Amara stood outside the venue as the city lights illuminated the streets around them. The noise of the event faded behind them, leaving only a quiet moment between two people whose lives had changed unexpectedly. You know, Alexander said, when I made that promise, I thought I was offering someone a chance to enter my world. Amara smiled. And now? He looked toward the city before answering. Now I understand that the greatest gift was being invited into yours. Amara remained silent for a moment, knowing that the words came from a place of honesty. The man standing beside her was still powerful. He was still respected, but he was no longer defined only by those things. He had learned that influence meant nothing without compassion. And as the evening came to an end, both of them understood that their story was never about a reward, a challenge, or a promise made in the past. It was about two people from completely different worlds discovering that respect could become the foundation of something truly meaningful. 1 year later, the story that began with a forgotten piece of trash had become a reminder throughout the city that the smallest choices could create the greatest changes. The Grand Meridian organization was no longer known only for its success, influence, or luxury. People began recognizing it for something far more valuable. It became known as a place where employees were respected, communities were supported, and every person had the opportunity to be heard. At the center of that transformation stood two people who came from completely different worlds. Alexander Romano, once a man who believed trust was a weakness, had become a leader who understood that respect was stronger than control. Amara Johnson, the woman who had never expected recognition, continued doing what she had always done. She listened. She helped. She reminded people that kindness did not need an audience to matter. The community programs they created together continued growing. Hundreds of families received support through educational resources, career opportunities, and neighborhood projects. Employees who once felt invisible discovered that their voices could influence important decisions. The changes were not created through one dramatic moment. They were created through countless small choices made every day. On a quiet afternoon, Alexander visited the community center where he first met Amara. The building looked almost the same, but the feeling inside had changed. Children filled the rooms with laughter. Volunteers worked together. Families walked through the doors knowing they would be welcomed. Alexander stood near the entrance for a moment, remembering the day he first arrived. Back then, he had been searching for someone who could prove that kindness still existed. Now he understood that kindness had always existed. He had simply stopped looking for it. Amara found him standing there and smiled. You look like you were thinking about something important. Alexander looked around the room before answering. I was thinking about how different everything would be if you had walked past that trash that day. Amara smiled gently. Maybe someone else would have picked it up. Alexander shook his head. Maybe, but I do not think someone else would have taught me the lesson I needed. They walked through the community center together, greeting familiar faces along the way. People respected Alexander, but they respected him for a different reason now. They no longer saw only a powerful businessman. They saw someone who had learned to listen. They saw someone who understood that leadership was not about standing above others. It was about standing with them. Later that evening, Alexander and Amara attended a small community celebration. There were no expensive decorations, no exclusive guest lists, and no expectations. There were families sharing meals, volunteers telling stories, and neighbors celebrating progress together. Alexander looked around the room and realized this was the kind of success he had never measured before. It was not found in financial reports or impressive buildings. It was found in moments like this. Before the evening ended, Alexander stepped outside with Amara and looked at the city lights. "Do you remember when I thought I was searching for someone worthy of my promise?" he asked. Amara smiled. "Yes," Alexander continued. "I thought I was looking for someone who could enter my world. But the truth was, I needed someone who could show me a better world." Amara looked at him with quiet understanding. The journey between them had never been about a challenge or a reward. It had been about two people discovering the value of seeing beyond appearances. Alexander had learned that power without compassion was incomplete. Amara had shown him that dignity could influence even the most guarded hearts. The next morning, the city continued moving as it always did. People walked through crowded streets, businesses opened their doors, and countless small decisions shaped the lives around them. Somewhere among those ordinary moments, someone noticed a piece of trash on the sidewalk and decided not to walk past it. They picked it up, not because anyone was watching, but because it was the right thing to do. And that was the lesson Alexander Romano would never forget. The greatest treasures in life are not always the things people search for. Sometimes they are the unexpected moments, the unexpected people, and the simple acts of kindness that reveal what truly matters. Because in the end, respect is not something power can demand. It is something a person earns through the way they treat others.